Welcome to Topic 2, where we will take a look at the GPT algorithm for calculating the maturity level of a regulatory authority. The algorithm starts with the sub-indicators. Only sub-indicators can be scored. They are scored based on their implementation status, such as not implemented or partially implemented. Cumulative scoring of all sub-indicators in one function affects the maturity level of that function. Indicators are not scored individually. The cumulative score of all sub-indicators related to one indicator will demonstrate its implementation percentage. Similarly, the regulatory functions are not scored individually. The maturity levels of these functions are based on the level of implementation of sub-indicators and their associated scores. The overall maturity of the regulatory system is calculated by an algorithm linked to the cumulative implementation of maturity levels of all functions. The algorithm considers the percentage of implementation across the indicators based on the scoring assigned to the sub-indicators. The lowest ML reached in any of the functions leads to the final ML of the regulatory system. Let's go back to this tabular data showing the distribution of sub-indicators by maturity level under each function. In total, there are 268 sub-indicators in the GPT. All regulatory functions and the corresponding number of sub-indicators are listed here. Let's consider the case of regulatory inspection for this example. There are 26 sub-indicators for RI, of which 3 sub-indicators are at ML1, 2 are at ML2, 13 are at ML3, and 8 are at ML4. To reach a specific maturity level, the number of sub-indicators to be implemented is the sum of all the sub-indicators prior that maturity level, added to those for that maturity level itself. For example, to achieve ML3 in the regulatory inspection function, the number of sub-indicators to be met is 3 at ML1 plus 2 at ML2 plus 13 at ML3, totaling 18 sub-indicators. Similarly, to reach ML4 in the regulatory system, the number of sub-indicators from ML1 to ML4, totaling 60 sub-indicators, must be implemented. We shall now explore the rating scale of each sub-indicator. When a sub-indicator is scored as not applicable, it means that the relevant requirements do not apply. This score should be supported by a justification. It is important to note that while this option may be applicable for some sub-indicators, it is never applicable for all of them. If no data is provided, but the sub-indicator is applicable, it is scored as not available. However, this score can only be assigned prior to benchmarking, when the regulatory authority is still preparing the self-benchmarking report. No sub-indicator can be scored as not available during formal benchmarking. When there is no evidence to demonstrate any degree of implementation of a sub-indicator, it is rated as not implemented. In cases where some components of a sub-indicator have been implemented, but not all, it is considered as ongoing implementation. Sub-indicators are rated as partially implemented, when requirements or activities are implemented, but the implementation is recent or relatively new with little cumulative data to demonstrate consistency. A sub-indicator is rated as implemented when the requirements or activities associated with it have been implemented consistently over time. Let's find out the mathematical meaning of the rating scale. If a sub-indicator is deemed not applicable, the requirement for that particular sub-indicator is removed. As a result, the total number of sub-indicators required to be met is reduced by 1. That is, the denominator is reduced by 1. Sub-indicators scored as not available receive a score of 0 out of 1. This equates to a percentage of implementation of 0. Sub-indicators categorized as not implemented also receive a score of 0 out of 1. The implementation percentage for the related sub-indicator is also 0%. Sub-indicators rated as ongoing implementation receive a score of 0.25 out of 1. This corresponds to an implementation percentage of 25%. Sub-indicators classified as partially implemented are given a score of 0.75 out of 1, reflecting an implementation percentage of 75%. Finally, sub-indicators marked as implemented receive a score of 1 out of 1, representing an implementation percentage of 100%. It's important to understand the differences between the two scoring options, not applicable and not implemented. When a sub-indicator is scored as not applicable, no gap is identified and no recommendation is mandatory. But evidence should be provided to support the non-applicability of the sub-indicator. This implies that the requirement stated within the sub-indicator is no more valid. The given score for the related sub-indicator is 0 out of 0. The related sub-indicator will be deducted from the total number of required sub-indicators. As a consequence, this rating will no more directly affect the implementation percentage and the maturity level. This is a possible rating for a few sub-indicators with good justification. On the other hand, a not implemented sub-indicator indicates that a gap has been identified and at least one recommendation, as part of the institutional development plan, must be provided. Not implemented score is the only option when no evidence is provided to support any level of implementation of a particular sub-indicator. The requirement stated within the sub-indicator is still valid, and the given score for the related sub-indicator will be 0 out of 1. The related sub-indicator will still be included within the total number of required sub-indicators. This rating will affect the implementation percentage and the maturity level. This is a possible rating for all sub-indicators. After completion of the benchmarking, once the GBT tool is populated, the system generates this type of diagram called the spider web diagram. In this example, the regulatory system, marketing authorization, licensing establishments, and lab testing are at ML3, while the rest of the functions are at ML2. By adopting the maturity level concept, gaps are easily identified and hence, capacity building priorities can be planned as per the identified gaps. In addition to the calculation so far described, called normal algorithm, the GBT provides the possibility to apply some flexibility in certain situations. Let's see how it works. With the flexible algorithm, for achieving maturity level 1, the regulatory authority should have attained 100% implementation of all the maturity level 1 sub-indicators. There is no flexibility here. For achieving maturity level 2, 95% implementation of all the maturity level 1 and 2 sub-indicators is a must, which means 5% of ML1 and 2 sub-indicators can be scored something other than fully implemented, but none of them can be scored as non-implemented. For achieving maturity level 3, 100% implementation of all the maturity level 1 and 2 sub-indicators and 90% implementation of all the maturity level 3 sub-indicators is required. This leaves 10% flexibility for ML3 sub-indicators, even if no sub-indicators can be scored as non-implemented. For achieving maturity level 4, 100% implementation of all the maturity level 1, 2, and 3 sub-indicators, and 80% implementation of all the maturity level 4 sub-indicators is required. This leaves 20% flexibility for ML4 sub-indicators. Again, no sub-indicator can be scored as non-implemented. In practical terms, when 57 out of 60 ML1 plus ML2 sub-indicators are met, that is scored implemented, then ML2 can be achieved using the flexible algorithm, which means the score of 3 sub-indicators can be ongoing or partially implemented. For ML3, all 60 ML1 and ML2 subindicators and 136 out of 151 ML3 subindicators should be met, that is scored implemented. 10% flexibility is allowed for 15 subindicators at ML3 that can be scored ongoing or partially implemented. To reach ML4 with the flexible algorithm, all 60 ML1 plus ML2 subindicators plus 151 ML3 subindicators plus 45 out of 56 subindicators at ML4 should be scored as implemented. 20% flexibility is thus allowed for 11 subindicators at ML4 across all functions. Please note that the percentage of implementation should be achieved on the level of the function as well. For example, to achieve ML3 in RS, 90% of the subindicators of RS which are at ML3 plus 100% of those at ML1 and ML2 should be implemented. In other words, for the flexible algorithm to be applied, subindicators scored ongoing or partially implemented cannot be all allocated in the same function. You have reached the end of the module. It's time now for a short activity to test your understanding of the concepts covered in the module.